And today, the focus has shifted to PCBs. Apparently, whatever that earlier contamination was, that was something of a different nature, an earlier chemical process or earlier industry. Maybe it was sewage, different from the chemical pollution that we're talking about. Have you seen the picture that
I haven't seen the picture, but I've read the historic accounts of what you're describing, and you're absolutely right. It was more associated with discharges that were on the river, and what'll happen, particularly with even the paper mill sludges, and this may have been before the PCBs, is that organic material wants to use the oxygen in the river as it begins to degrade. Then it's just part of the natural process, and as it uses the oxygen of the river, it reduces the dissolved oxygen within the river, and fish depend on that dissolved oxygen to breathe through their gills. And but in the 50s, while Michigan was fortunate and did have a Water Resources Commission Act that called for making sure that you weren't impacting on rivers in a manner that would impact on public health and the environment, there wasn't a federal law at that point. And if you recall, the federal law didn't really come into being until I believe it was 1972. When the Clean Water Act was adopted. And it was under the Clean Water Act that there was more of a national program starting in, I believe it was 1972, to make sure that things of industrial discharge as well as even municipal wastewater treatment plants that were discharging were meeting certain types of standards in water quality. And it's largely due to that the type of laws went into effect and regulations went into effect to start the control of different types of waste discharges that were being discharged not only to the Kalamazoo River but other rivers in Michigan as well.
Now, coming back to the Superfund negotiations a little bit. The Kalamazoo River site, it's about 80 miles long. It's the largest Superfund site in Michigan.
That's in terms of length, yes, yeah. Yes, it is.
And when we talk about a Superfund, that's something that's under federal jurisdiction, the EPA.
That's correct.
And you're with the DEQ, a state department.
Right.
And then you also mentioned the DNR, that's another state department. And then we have the responsible parties, and you mentioned two. So when we're looking at how to implement, a cleanup process, we're really talking about a negotiation between the federal government, the state government, the responsible parties, and it's a law that says to the responsible parties, if we can reach an agreement and you do X, Y, and Z, then we're not going to sue you. But if you don't agree to clean things up, then we may seek a legal remedy. I mean, that's kind
sure,
of
you could seek a legal remedy, or the alternative would be for the state or EPA to go in and do the cleanup, and then they would charge the costs for that cleanup back to the companies, then the responsible parties. Now, there's also the involvement we need to bring into the loop here, the trustees, because as part of this particular Superfund site, it's pretty clear there's been natural resource damages. There have been damages as a result of the fisheries. Because the fish have PCBs in it, it means that they can't be used normally as they would. Because of the floodplains, or at least the lower the sediments that are in the impoundment that are exposed now, have essentially become kind of a floodplain area. We have wildlife in there, so there are damages that likely may have occurred to the wildlife. So when that happens, we also involve a group of trustees, and the trustees are made of both federal and state agencies. And in this particular case, it was the Fish and Wildlife Service out of the Department of Interior, as well as the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, I believe it's called. And both of them were also involved in addition to the Department of Justice. And on the state side, the trustees include the Attorney General's office, the Department of Natural Resources, as well as the Department of Environmental Quality. So you not only have the technical groups dealing with the cleanups that are required to meet the standards and criteria under the Superfund program and the state program, but you also have another group dealing with what the damages are, and all of those needed to be brought together to try to move forward with this first effort in the removal of the Plainwell Dam and the cleanup of the Plainwell impoundment.
So it's a quite complicated tangle of interests that are coming together.
Very much so.
And there there's some earlier cleanups along sections of the river, correct? There have been other parts of the river with impoundments that have been...
There has been some minimal work that the department was involved with. I believe it was at Bryan Mill Pond, where there were large concentrations again that were excavated in the dry. They put in cofferdams to do those removals. And a lot of that, excuse me, a lot of that work has been completed. It's still being monitored and observed, and there's still additional work even to do in those areas. As I said, a lot of work also as part of the Superfund process, but it isn't observed in the river, is looking at the sources again, at the individual lands of the paper companies to ensure that materials might not have sloughed off into the river, so those have been pulled back out of the river and contained, and we're trying to make sure that those are placed in a type of containment where they can continue to be monitored and assured that they're not getting back into the system.
And what has recently occurred is that we have an agreement on work for a certain part of the river, the Plainwell impoundment just above the Plainwell Dam, and then this agreement was fairly recently announced between the EPA, DEQ, DNR, the responsible parties, and it's going to involve removing some of this sediment and impoundment, removing it to a landfill, and then eventually removing at least part of the Plainwell Dam.
That's correct. And what our expectation is that this work's going to be commencing very shortly. We're pushing April here, and we're expecting that some of the work, you'll start seeing equipment coming into the area as early as April. And we're anticipating that this particular work is probably going to take a 2-year period in that area. So you'll probably see some of the equipment on the riverbanks as they're working at this, and over time, the ultimate experience here is to get the removal of the first dam and make that a free-flowing river again.
Why did we start with this site, this Plainwell area? Why was that chosen?
The primary reason for that is, as I mentioned, there's contamination in each of the impoundments as you move downriver where a dam exists. And this happens to be the uppermost impoundment where we know contamination exists.
Well, Jim, thank you for coming on my program. We're nearly out of time, but just to summarize, Mr. Sygo is a Deputy Director with the DEQ, Department of State, Department of Environmental Quality. They recently announced, together with the EPA, the DNR, and the responsible parties, that a section of the Kalamazoo River near Plainwell, above the Plainwell Dam, there'll be cleanup commencing, and if you're watching in that area, you'll see trucks moving contaminated sediment out and taking them into a landfill. So this is a significant step forward, and I think people in the Kalamazoo Valley should be pleased to see some activity happening and the cleanup moving forward. So thanks for coming on my program, Jim.
Certainly welcome.
Thanks for watching. I'll be back next month with another guest from Lansing. Thank you very much.